Good afternoon. I will call this meeting of the House Finance and Policy Committee to order. Up first, we have approval of the minutes. Vice Chair Agbaje, would you move the minutes?
I will, but I do have one change.
Let us know what that change is, please, Vice Chair.
On page 1, 2, 3, just the count of the votes on that amendment just needs to be switched, and then that's it.
We've noted that and got that fixed. With that amendment, all those in favor, say aye. Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Vice Chair, thank you for reading the minutes. We appreciate that. And you're up first.
Okay.
And while the Vice Chair is heading up, this is our only bill up today. It represents a lot of work that this committee's done. And so I want to thank members that have contributed to the discussion. All our parts of these bills have been heard before, and look forward to the discussion on what is an omnibus renters landlord-tenant law package. And so first, Vice Chair, let's do some housekeeping. Would you like to move the DE amendment, the DE3?
Yes, Chair Howard, I'd like to move the DE3 amendment.
All those in favor of the DE3, say aye. Aye. Opposed? And then we have an amendment to the DE3, which is the A1. Vice Chair, would you like to move the A1?
Yes, Chair Howard, I'd like to move the A1 amendment.
Any discussion to the A1? If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, with the amended DE3 before us, Vice Chair, please present the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Today, I'm here to present an updated House File 917. This bill now includes varied tenants' rights housing measures that have been heard in this committee. The importance of this bill is to address the needs that have beleaguered tenants for many years in Minnesota. Renters make up to 30% of households across Minnesota, and in most of our populous cities, renters are close to or more than 50% of households. Renting, especially for those who are low or middle income, can sometimes be a precarious way to live if your landlord is one that is absent, doesn't follow through with their end of the bargain, or does not have the skills to be a landlord. Unfortunately, in those situations, the landlord still has more power, and the tenant is limited in how they can hold landlords accountable. This bill package is an opportunity for tenants to begin to do that by clearly spelling out their rights and the rights of the landlord in certain situations. It also outlines the best practices that many of our landlords are already implementing with their tenants. Overall, this bill seeks to balance the power dynamics between landlords and renters. Some of the bill provisions include prohibiting discrimination based on the use of public assistance. It also includes much-needed reforms in the eviction court process to better ensure that tenants have a clear understanding of the allegations against them and where they can receive help. Tenants would now no longer need to pay to the court to be able to hear their counterclaims and defenses. And the package also includes a 14-day eviction notice so that tenants and landlords have time to negotiate or mediate before things escalate to the courtroom. The bill deals with expungements of eviction records so that tenants can more readily move on after an eviction. And finally, the bill keeps court records non-public until there has been an adjudication in favor of the landlord. The changes presented here are the culmination of hours of work between the varied bill authors and stakeholders, including supporters and those who have expressed concerns. I'm grateful for the trust that the various bill authors have had in me to carry this forward and ensure that we are creating a fairer space where landlords and tenants can work together to hopefully prevent evictions and the loss of housing. So with that, I can also turn it over to House Research to kind of describe the bill and technically walk through the bill as well, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Davis, if you'd help us walk through the bill.
Sure, Chair and members. I'm going to take you through the DE3. So starting on page 1, this is Mary Davis from the House Research Department. I'm going to start with Article 1, which deals with tenants' rights. Section 1 is the rental assistance discrimination prohibition, and it prohibits a landlord from refusing federal, state, or local housing assistance, including housing choice vouchers like Section 8 in housing or real estate, and it provides that a violation is a violation of the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Section 2 provides that when any kind of animal is allowed on a rental property, a landlord can't advertise in a way that would discourage a potential renter from renting the unit who has not declawed or devocalized their pets. And they can't refuse a rental unit to a current renter or require them to declaw or devocalize their pets, and also provides penalties for that. Section 3 on the top of page 3 requires a landlord to disclose fees on the front page of a lease and in any advertisement, and imposes a penalty for violating that section. Sections 4 and 5 provide that along with other provisions related to the return of a damage deposit, the landlord is liable for damages when they don't provide notice and do an initial or final inspection. And Section 5 provides the portions of that require a landlord to do the walkthrough at the beginning and end of a tenancy. Section 6 on page 4 restricts landlords' entry into a residential unit between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. and clarifies that notice needs to be given 24 hours before entry unless they agree to a different option. Section 7 changes the penalty for a landlord who enters an apartment without proper notice. So now a violation of that section would be up to $500 in reasonable attorney's fees. Section 8 requires the court to appoint counsel to represent defendants in a housing eviction case when the defendant is a resident of public housing. And this requires the complaint in those cases to provide that notice to tenants about their opportunity for counsel, and also provides the qualifications of the attorneys in these cases and how they're compensated. Article 2, which begins on page 6, deals with leases and covenants and repairs in residential tenancy. Section 1 requires the landlord to provide heat in a residential tenancy at a minimum of 68 degrees during the winter months or when the temperatures dropped. Section 2 allows unlawful exclusion cases when a tenant's been locked out to be brought for the same filing fee as the one they use in conciliation court. Section 3 specifies the type of incidents that allow a tenant to petition for emergency repairs in residential units. Section 4 allows a tenant to petition for emergency relief to fix an emergency repair and allows a court to order that a landlord remedy the violation. Article 3, which starts on page 9, deals with lease terminations. Section 1 removes the provision that allows a landlord to terminate a tenancy without a written lease with 14 days' notice. The existing law requires notice to be as long as the intervals between time as rent would be due. Section 2 requires a landlord in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, or Duluth to wait until 6 months before the end of a lease and not sooner to ask a tenant if they want to renew their lease and stay in the unit as long as the lease is for more than 10 months. Section 3 allows a tenant to terminate a lease if the tenant requires assistance with daily living, needs to go to a nursing care facility, has a disability related to mental illness, is going to hospice or a board and care facility, assisted living, and adult foster care. And it requires a tenant in those situations to provide 2 months advance notice and medical documentation to the landlord. Article 4 starts on page 11, and that deals with residential evictions. Section 1 changes the procedure when an eviction alleges a material lease violation and rent owed in an eviction. Section 2 alters existing procedures in eviction actions for non-payment of rent, including allowing a government agency to assist with the redemption of the unit. Section 3 provides a new procedure for the summons in an eviction action, including notice for how to get legal and financial assistance, and provide the content of the notice to tenants is included with those eviction cases, and that the case shouldn't move forward if the notice hasn't been provided. Section 4 expands option for notifying a tenant of an eviction action when the tenant cannot be found, including using phone calls, texts, or emails. Section 5 prevents bond from being posted for a tenant except when the case is being appealed. Section 6 allows the court to issue an expungement when the tenant prevails in an eviction action. Section 7 allows a party to bring a motion to vacate a judgment in an eviction action for situations such as where the judgment was entered as a result of a mistake, surprise, or excusable neglect, fraud, or misconduct, or new evidence was discovered. Section 8 provides new requirements for the summons on a writ of recovery and an order to vacate a rental unit, including notice on how to seek legal assistance. Section 9 clarifies when the court can what the court can require in an appeal case for a bond. Section 10 requires a stay for all appeals. Section 11 is technical and conforming changes. Section 12 amends an exception for certain actions in an appeal proceeding and provides the exceptions apply in claims where a plaintiff prevailed on an action related to a breach of the lease by unlawful activity. And Section 13 provides effective dates for Article 4. Article 5 relates to eviction records. The first section amends the procedure for discretionary expungements. The second section adds additional situations where evictions must be expunged by the court. And the third section requires the court to keep an eviction case filing confidential until after the case has been decided. And that is all of the DE3.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Next, we will proceed to testimony. Or Vice Chair, do you have any further comments, or should we proceed to testimony?
Testifiers.
Wonderful. Up first, we have Rachel Sterling, housing attorney with Homeline. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. Never been so tall. Good afternoon, Chair Howard and members of the committee. My name is Rachel Sterling, and I am a housing attorney at Homeline. While there are a handful of improvements we would suggest for House File 917, I want to focus my time today on addressing the current proposed language regarding fees and pre-eviction notices. Firstly, fees. It is currently understood that a landlord is allowed to charge a tenant rent to cover their costs of running their business. But what is often less clear to the customer, their tenant, is how much that cost actually is. This section of the bill is about providing clarity, which the current language just does not do. The original language proposed in House File 315 addresses the core of the issue, making any non-refundable, non-optional fees a part of the advertised rent. The original language creates clarity and saves tenants from applying for places they can't afford, and landlords from sifting through applications from people that they're likely to deny anyway. The original language also helps clarify what is considered rent, as opposed to a fee for things like, say, renters' credit calculations. For example, under the current proposed language, a landlord could charge $800 per month in rent, as well as a $400 monthly administration or amenity fee, but only report that $800 for CRP purposes, severely underrepresenting the actual costs the tenant has paid. Additionally, the original language ensured that the tenants would not be charged an additional monthly fee simply to pay their electric bill, a fee we see many tenants being charged in addition to their base rent. The current language should be changed to disallow this type of nickel and diming and just incorporate that cost into the advertised total monthly payment. Another minor but important addition would be to the proposed language around pre-eviction notices. The original bill had language that said that if a residential tenant applied for financial assistance from the county, that a landlord would cooperate with that application process. This language is important to include to ensure that the tenants are able to utilize all of the resources available to them when they need them.
Thank you. Next, we have Ivory Taylor, Associate Director of the Housing Justice Center. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Howard and members of the committee. My name is Ivory Taylor. I'm Associate Director with Housing Justice Center. I'm here to testify in support of House File 917. Growing up in poverty in Minnesota, my family and I relied on housing choice vouchers, public housing, and the shelter systems to keep a roof over our heads. Without strong renter protections in place, we lived through a revolving door of housing instability. I went to 5 different schools in 5 years. My mother's health declined rapidly, forcing her to apply for disability and for me to start working multiple jobs at age 14. In order to attend college, I had to take out large amounts of student debt solely to pay for room and board, and I experienced housing instability well into my 30s. These experiences and those of the renters I work with every day let me know that tenant-landlord law has not met the needs of Minnesotans for decades, and we need to prioritize making foundational changes to ensure that the most basic of protections are afforded to the approximately 620,000 renter households in the state. As we know, Minnesota holds the shameful distinction of holding some of the largest racial and economic disparities in the country. This legacy is made abundantly clear in the way our current housing system works for renters in Minnesota. We also know that trickle-down economics, or trickle-down housing in this case, does not work. Simply building more housing does not advance equity. In fact, it has been shown to further gentrification and often leads to further segregation and displacement. Building housing foundations without building foundational housing rights for renters is counterproductive to the state's goals of affirmatively furthering fair housing in our communities. One strong way to answer this mandate is source of income protections. Regardless of a landlord's intent, when choosing not to rent to someone with rental assistance, the outcome is and will always be discrimination. Due to racial and economic disparities, recipients of rental assistance programs are predominantly from marginalized groups. These protected groups face the burdens of a system that has purposefully stolen and denied housing and wealth-building opportunities for generations, and we are allowing legal discrimination to continue to this day without protection in place. It is a choice to be in the business of landlording. It is not a choice to seek and obtain housing, especially when being unhoused is met with policing and criminalization. When we have no long-term, dignified, and sustainable solutions for homelessness, renter protections are the best preventative measure we can take to ensure Minnesotans can live in dignity. Finally, I regularly see leases that are 15 to 30 pages long. These contracts are coercive by their very nature. Tenants are not able to negotiate favorable lease terms on their own behalf. They either take it or face homelessness or the potential never-ending search for finding a place to rent. It is the state's responsibility to step up and act as the negotiating arm on behalf of renters, as protecting consumers of a service is a long recognized piece of appropriate governance. It's time to move toward a more equal relationship between the millions of renters in Minnesota and landlords. When we have the largest disparities in the nation, we must make brave steps to make inroads toward closing these gaps. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Leanna Stefaniak with Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Leanna Stefaniak, and I am the board chair for the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. I've also worked in the multifamily industry for nearly 20 years, specializing in market rate units, NOAA units, and affordable housing units. I'm here today to offer my testimony on House File 917, specifically the mandatory Section 8 provisions found in Article 1. I respectfully oppose the mandatory Section 8 proposal in House File 917 because it is a mandate to Minnesota property managers and housing providers to participate in the federal government's Housing Choice Voucher Program. House File 917 makes it a discriminatory practice if the landlord does not participate in the program. This refusal is not a discriminatory act against the participant, rather it's a refusal to participate in a federal program. Minnesota has a first-in-line requirement, which offers no discretion to the housing provider. That means that the housing provider must accept the first application that meets its criteria. This is why the proposal mandates participation. Section 8 is designed to be a voluntary program. Voluntary program, one where the housing provider is choosing to participate and voluntarily enters into the housing assisted payment contract, which is a federal contract. With this proposal, the state of Minnesota would be taking away the housing provider's right to voluntarily execute a contract and rather force them to sign a federal agreement that they would otherwise not agree to. The HAP contract is more than just an agreement to accept a rental subsidy from the federal government. It is a lengthy, cumbersome document that provides little recourse to the housing provider and stipulations that are well beyond the normal residential lease agreement. And when in conflict, it is the terms of the HAP contract that prevails. It unilaterally and fundamentally alters the residential lease agreement between the housing provider and the resident. Under the HAP contract, the housing authority can reduce and completely ignore payments to the housing provider with no recourse for the housing provider. The housing authority has no liability for resident behavior. There is no guarantee of a security deposit. The housing authority may terminate the HAP contract if available program funding is no longer sufficient to support continued assistance, and then the tenant is not responsible for the payments that were guaranteed under that HAP contract. Meaning, if the housing authority stops payments to the housing provider cannot terminate the tenancy as a result. Forced participation in a government program where there is little to no recourse for the housing provider is the wrong direction for Minnesota. The legislature could instead consider a light touch option that would encourage housing providers to participate in the program through incentives or other voluntary means. I would recommend to the chair and the members to consider funding a participation incentive to grow the Section 8 program in Minnesota. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for hearing me this afternoon.
Thank you. Next, we have Bernadette Hornig with Hornig Companies. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm here to raise some concerns about House File 917. My specific concerns are related to the implementation date. As it's written, it's August of 2023. And I firmly believe that most in my industry, as a property owner and manager, want to comply with the laws and treat our residents with respect and dignity. But I don't believe that we will be able to digest and train an entire industry on these sweeping changes in 2 months. Realistically, by the time it gets passed and all the details are worked out, we're looking at May, it's the summer, and if it goes into effect in August, I think that it's not going to be able to be implemented in a way that's just and equitable for the residents as well, because it is confusing if people are saying, oh, do this, oh, wait, no, do that, don't do this, don't do that. That just stresses everybody out. So I would encourage at least looking at August of 2024 as a reasonable implementation date so that we can work out the details. I'm also concerned about the 14-day notice. I've been here before talking about that specific issue, and one of the concerns I have in this particular draft is that there's no preemption language. So some of our zealous friends at this particular cities have already implemented notice requirements, and the timelines are different. So Brooklyn Park, for example, is 30 days. Minneapolis is 14 days, but it has different requirements in the notice, that sort of thing. Again, going back to the spirit of wanting to comply and doing the right thing, I think it would streamline things significantly if the notice was required uniformly across the state. The timeline was consistent and potentially even shortened to 7 days. But I do think it's important that we use the same notice. For residents, they are mobile people and they want to have choices moving from community to community. And I think it's confusing if you're getting one notice from one community, another notice from another community, you get 30 days here, you get 14 days here, you get 4 days over here. That's not, I think, the message that we want to send, that people receive equal protections across the state of Minnesota. So I would encourage that we look at that language as well. This is obviously a very technical and sweeping bill, and I think rushing it through without proper sort of time to digest the technical aspects of it are really going to be detrimental to the rental property market in Minnesota. And I would encourage all of you really to take a look at the very specific details and get down in the weeds and make sure that this works so that we can provide the best level of service to renters across the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Cecil Smith, Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Cecil Smith. I'm the President and CEO of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. We represent 2,200 members who serve 600,000 renters who make their home in our more than 300,000 rental homes. The inclusion of mandatory Section 8 is a serious concern for several reasons, but especially because it is a mandate to property owners and managers to participate in the federal government's Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. The proposal would make non-participation a discriminatory practice. That is not how our industry functions or should function. We are non-discriminatory. We appreciate the effort, especially by the author, to make the language about notice of entry and prohibited fees functional, but we're still concerned about other included provisions in the amended bill which have not had language changes to meet the threshold of a functional statute. Those provisions include the expungement of almost all eviction records, a minimum heat, and the Emergency Tenant Remedies Action expansion. We also believe the 14-day notice requirement will make Minnesota an outlier. The majority of changes to the law have an effective date of August 1st, which is unworkable. With over 28,000 jobs in our industry operations, the industry will need time to understand the law, develop training programs for their staff, and implement business processes in compliance with the law. We suggest August 2024 as an effective date. This proposal is not alone in creating a disincentive to invest in Minnesota. Nationally, Minnesota is recognized as a rent control state because of the adoption of rent control in St. Paul. At a time when rising interest rate risks are pushing down development, housing providers and developers face further challenges attracting investors to our state, such as the proposal to increase the capital gains tax being heard in committees in both bodies. All these proposals and the one before you only serve to reduce the vital supply of housing and increase the cost of housing. Our housing policy framework is headed in the wrong direction. The last 10 years of record-setting development produced over $12 billion of new housing in the metro area. But we need at least 100,000 units of new housing across the state to meet demand. At today's development pricing, that's a $25 billion investment. That means we need to attract a 75% increase over existing levels of investment to meet current demand. We're going in the wrong direction to solve our housing affordability challenge. We're going in the wrong direction to attract the $25 billion of capital to Minnesota. I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to testify on the bill? If not, we can go to member discussion. Members, Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm just going to say a few comments about what we've heard and what we've seen here in this particular bill. And one of the testifiers brought up the idea of how large some of these rental contracts are. I just want to remind us that almost in all cases, that's because of mandates and regulations that we put on, requirements. In order to accommodate everything, notifications and all the other things, it requires lawyers to be involved with it in order to make sure that they aren't violating one thing or another. And I think that's an example. That's an example of why we need to be careful about what we continually add on to our demands and requirements. Because it can be quite a nightmare trying to make sure that you're doing everything right. In regards to expungement and certainly the immediate expungement on some of these issues that are occurring, certainly if the tenant has been certainly vindicated and he did nothing or she did nothing wrong, that makes perfectly sense. But others for just arbitrary makes a concern, and here's how I would explain it. For those of you that have cars, if you wanted to rent that car to somebody, wouldn't you want to be able to go back and find out what their behavior is behind the wheel? And if expungement, which in my opinion is really a do-over, is taken away so that you don't have that availability to find out, you could be putting your car into the hands of somebody that really isn't going to take care of it. A house or a building is even a bigger investment, and certainly you ought to be able to have an understanding about the behaviors of the individual that you're renting to. It's not that certainly they can do it however they wish, but I think it's time that we also understand that we all have to take a responsibility for our actions and for our behavior. And if it's a situation where the behavior is something that everybody should be concerned about, I think that's a valid piece. I mean, there are many other things too in this bill, and Mr. Chair, I know where this is going, but I think there are some concerns, and I think we want to be careful about this bill, and I would certainly recommend a no vote.
Vice Chair Agbaje, response or comment? Representative Dotseth.
Thank you, Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje. You know, when I first got on this committee, we actually had a good meeting with Chairman Howard, and we said, let's really work on some legislation that we can actually work together on. Unfortunately, this isn't it. I mean, I really want to work on some things that we can actually work together for the best interests of all of Minnesota. When we're looking at mandatory Section 8, I mean, there's some concerns there. To minimum heating at, what are we looking at, 68 degrees? My home is at 68 degrees. I don't even know how I can keep a consistent temperature of 68 degrees in my own home. So for a landlord, and to expect this type of legislation on a landlord, it's just, my opinion, unworkable at this time. I think the legislators across the table, how many of you have actually read this legislation and read the language that's in here? You know, we want legislation that we can work together on. And I see some heads nodding yes. We're looking at the 14-day notice, the expungement. I think we've heard that language already. We've talked about that. As a landlord, it makes it extremely challenging to enforce some of these items that are here. And I think this is really unjust and unequitable for the housing providers at this time. I think we need to take a little pause on this and actually work through the language that's here, because this is completely over the top, in my opinion. So I asked Chair Howard, I would like to work with us further on this, but this is just unworkable at this time. I would recommend a no vote as well. Thank you.
Representative Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair Agbaje, for this bill. This bill is the work of many advocates in many, many years. It's not something that just fell from the sky that landed here. One of the reps said that, how many of you read this legislation? Some of us have been working on this legislation for the last 4 years, and other advocates have been working on it for the last 30 years. This state is considered a landlord-friendly, supposedly, which means that our landlord laws have not been ratified in many decades, which also means that our tenants do not get a fair chance. If you want injustice, it's injustice that people can get evicted. And if you ever have a chance to go to a housing court, I advise you, please go. Landlords and you know, companies who own buildings come with fancy lawyers, while you have sometimes single mothers and poor families who neither understand what's actually happening nor know what the process is. They show up at a court because they got a letter that says you are being affected, you have to show up at court. And before you know it, they're affected. And if somebody tells you that eviction takes a long time, that is not true, at least not in Hennepin County. That I know for sure. It does not take a long time to evict people. I have shared this story where I had a family I was working with come up to me and said, hey, we got this letter a few weeks ago we didn't read. And when I read the letter, it said that they were supposed to be at court few weeks ago, which, because they don't speak English, the letter is written in English, they don't read English, and then by the time we were reading the letter, they were at no show at court, and then they ended up being affected. One of the reasons why we have homelessness is 90% of evictions are because people are unable to pay. And it's not because people are not choosing to spend their money elsewhere and have fun with it. It's sometimes because things happen. Life happens. People lose their jobs. Somebody gets sick. Something happens in their lives that prevents them from paying that rent. And because of that, we're going to scar them and put an eviction on their record that follows them around forever. Makes no sense to me, and I don't know if it makes sense to other people. In my opinion, I don't think our laws go far enough right now. The bill in front of us could go far enough. It doesn't go far enough. But I'll leave that, you know, for us to agree to disagree on that issue. Yes, we can work on together on many other issues, but we have eviction skyrocketing. We have families being evicted. We have people sleeping outside. I shared the story of my friend coming from Norway and saying that how is it possible that there are human beings living outside? There has to be something that we can do, and I invite the landlords and the associations out there to come to the table and propose solutions that keep people housed. Because it's not enough that we say, oh yeah, people make mistakes and we're protecting bad behavior. We're not protecting bad behavior. We're talking about children with families. We're talking about people with disabilities. We're talking about people who are struggling with mental health issues, chemical addictions. We're talking about human beings who are sleeping outside. I came from Somalia. My family came from Somalia when I was 10 years old, and we went through the refugee camp. And every time I see the encampments, that's what I remember. Those blue tents, that's where we stayed. Nobody should sleep outside. And these laws are going to protect people, literally save lives. That's what they're going to do. And I'm super thankful for your leadership, Chair, and Vice Chair Agbaje, and all the advocates and other members who have worked on this many, many years, and to get it in the finish, across the finish line. Thank you.
Representative Hussain.
Thank you for your comment, Madam Chair. Hassan, and you're always fighting for all the communities. And Agbaje, Representative, thanks for bringing this forward. I used to be a renter, and I had many experience, and my community had this problem in the past. Minnesota has one of the worst laws to protect tenants for the entire country, and we have opportunity to address this as a legislator. In Wisconsin, has a better protections when it comes to tenant. Minnesota do not have an opportunity for all those tenants, and I can relate to the information that Representative Hassan stated in comment. It is affecting our community, which is the largest people who rent, renters, and they don't have a place. This is affecting money of. And this is leading to people homelessness. It's not something that we can tolerate. We need to address that as legislators. We're here to protect people and to make what's right for all people and for all humans. Thanks for bringing this bill forward and protecting tenants in the state of Minnesota. Thank you.
Representative Myers.
Thank you, Chair. We have housing providers right now that have entered into a lot of contracts with people. They've, I think, done a fairly good job of, following the rules that are on the books. And, we want to make sure that we do give them a, some reasonableness in complying, because something is going to be passed. We don't know what that's going to be. But, I think we heard it here in testimony that, they want to make sure that they can comply with whatever's put in there. And so, from those testifiers, I'm hoping, you'll look at, an implementation date. We've got contracts that, people are still entering into now that, hoping it's not going to supersede it. But if, something gets past this session that's implemented in a future date, then people can start, changing their contracts now and giving them time to make sure they're in compliance. Because I think the last thing, landlords, tenants want is to get into notice issues where they're arguing over the notices and not focusing on resolutions or compliance. So hopefully you will consider that.
Vice Chair Agbaje.
Thank you, Chair Howard. Thank you, Representative Myers. I think that's a really good point. We will probably still continue to look at the implementation date just to make sure that it has the appropriate time so people can get educated on what the new rules will be. And yeah, I agree with you. We want to make sure that everyone is set up for success in this.
Representative Myers. Representative Cha.
Thank you, Chair Howard. Quiet enjoyment is the right to inhabit or use certain property without disturbance. The right to quiet enjoyment protects tenants from intrusion and guarantees certain basic necessities of a home. So thank you, Agbaje, and Chair Howard, and Hassan, Kozlowski, Perez Vega, for all these legislation to help address home disparities in Minnesota. And although all these bills, legislation may not be perfect, it's a start. And this is where we start. Thank you.
Representative Perez Vega.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. I keep getting confused in this committee when I hear, housing provider, because if I'm a tenant, does that mean I'm a business provider? I mean, this language is so supportive to families that are struggling and to children. Last week, I had probably the most amount of people that have visited my office since I've been elected. Okay, standing outside, filling up the whole floor, not to visit all of us, but just like one at a time. And it was full of children, and it was full of mothers and families and elders and babies that they're not looking for these handouts, or they're not here to be taken advantage of as human beings that deserve a roof and deserve their families to feel what this American dream, this state of privilege, and all of these, I'm a rapper, I'm a poet, these lyrics that are put into what justice looks like. And boy, there is a housing justice crisis in our state. Greater Minnesota, Metro, right here, my district. And this bill is like hope. It's hope for those families. It's hope for those children that came not looking for handouts, looking for their human right. They're acting as saying, Representative Perez Vega, we're being treated like dogs, like we're begging for kibbles and bits here. And Representative Agbaje, a colleague, an hermana fighting for justice, with all of what we're trying to give to just bring to those kids that were outside, that were crying, those mothers that are workers, working 3 jobs to provide for their families and saying, we've been homeless before. We know this game. We've been hit with evictions. We've been hit with the opportunity also to have housing, but this eviction clause is like hurting me. Help. And this is help. This is help. We have heard cries and tears and requests from us as legislators to do our job, all of us, on every side of the aisle, to not leave families frozen in the street who don't come from generational wealth, who come from surviving an injustice of discrimination and racism. We had Sovereignty Day yesterday. These aren't just fables and myths. This is reality. And this all is braided together in these policies that we as elected officials have to do our jobs to ensure that we're protecting humanity here. And housing is a human right. So muchas gracias. I'm so proud to be a part of this work with you. Thank you.
Minority Lead, Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje, I understand what you're trying to do here. There are some good things in the bill, and there's some clunkers. The vast majority of housing providers provide a good service. They provide housing for those in need, and most are doing their best to provide good shelter and homes to those who need them. As we move forward with this bill, we have to be careful, because if the balance beam tips too far one way, we're actually going to lose rental units for people to rent. And that's the last thing we want to do. Most housing providers do not want to evict their tenants. They like their tenants. They want to do everything they can to help them. If they get into the eviction part of it, it's a loss for everybody, not just for the tenant, but it's a loss for the housing provider as well. Because he has a lot of costs. The cost of the courts and the paperwork, the cost of serving the notice. Minnesota law requires that the housing provider has to have a lawyer. And then there's no revenue coming in for the unit because the rent is not being paid generally. Now, I've talked to a lot of housing providers, not just this year, but the entire time I've been down here. And none of them want to do the foreclosure or the eviction process. If they tell me if a tenant is having issues and having trouble, they want to work with them. But a lot of times they never tell them. I don't know if because they're ashamed because they can't pay it or not. Most of them know a week or two ahead of time that they're not going to be able to make rent. And generally, all they have to do is make a phone call or go knock on the manager's door. And generally, they'll get something worked out. Now, one thing that you have in your bill on line 5.14 to 5.21 is a right to counsel. The question I have is, who is paying for that? Is that going to be through civil legal services? Is that going to be through the public defenders? Or where is the funds for those lawyers going to be coming from?
Vice Chair Agbaje.
Thank you, Chair Howard. Thank you, Representative Johnson, for that question. That's an excellent question. So currently, the bill talks about setting up groups that will talk about what those costs and fees will be. In terms of paying for it, we are looking at kind of similar models that already exist in state law, particularly in the child protection area, where some children have a right to counsel. And so we'll probably be looking at payment systems close to that. And then, we're still discussing with folks and trying to see what else ends up passing out of this biennium to see if there'll be more funding available.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje, I appreciate that answer. I believe it's going to probably be in the civil legal services who cannot, even when I think we have a bill to give them $50 million a year, and I don't think that'll even cover all the extra expenses. They cannot handle their caseload now, even with the $50 million coming. They still won't be able to handle the caseload that they have now. So I'm not sure where the funding is going to come for this. There's many things I can talk about in this bill, but I think I'll save a lot of them for the floor. But I do want you to know that I did talk to a number of housing providers in my community. I had them take a look at this bill. What I heard was not good for my community. Just every one of them said if this bill passes in its current form, all their properties will be sold. And I have a lot of single family units. I have a number of multi-units. In fact, I've had a lot of multi-units built in my community, and some of those management said they're going to sell their units off, not as rental units, but they're going to change them to condominiums. And that's not what we want. I was also brought up about the process of evictions. I don't know what goes on in Hennepin County, but I know what goes on in my county. I served eviction notices. Or if I remember correctly, there's 4 stages of eviction process before you get to the final one, where the law enforcement actually goes and physically removes a person. It can take 9 to 12 months. And that's 9 to 12 months is 9 months to 12 months with no rent coming in to cover the cost of that unit. That's a lot of, if it's a single-family home that's being rented out, that makes it very difficult for the property owner to make the mortgage payment. It could go into foreclosure. And a lot of these people, that's the income that they have to survive. So that makes it, the process, even worse. It's not just hurting one family because they're not paying the rent, it's hurting multiple families. So we got to be careful how we do things. I'm going to leave with one remark that Lyndon Baines Johnson said. You do not examine legislation in the light of the benefits it will convey if properly administered, but in the light of the wrongs it would do and harms it would cause if improperly administered. We have to be careful how we write legislations. There's unintended consequences. And like I said, there's some good things in this bill, but there's some clunkers that actually going to hurt. And my final remarks is some of the letters that are in our packets. I'm from the Realtors Association. Overall, the DE3 amendment would add to the challenges of owning and managing rental properties. They already have a lot of challenges. Right now, it costs more to build one than it is to, than you can get to from rent and stuff, especially in greater Minnesota. When you don't have a return on investment, you cannot get the capital to build. From Stephen Scott, who's the Vice President of Property Management. I appreciate what I believe is the intent behind this bill is trying to do, codify management's best practices. We follow best practices and know it is likely aimed primarily at and more predictably predatory landlords. However, within the industry best practices, we have a few grave concerns related to House File 917. And I feel the need to highlight some of those reasons why I strongly urge you to modify or dismiss altogether. It talks about Article 1, Article 2, and Article 4, which has some issues that has been talked about in here by other testifiers. And also in from multi-housing, which did testify, I believe they did testify. Several years ago, housing providers were concerned with the administration of Minneapolis's Section 8 program. After some participants raised their concerns, the local public housing authority reformed the program through incentives, internal process changes, increased staffing, and improved communication. I think that would be a much better way to go. And I've also read the federal law dealing with Section 8 housing. It's not that easy just to give the voucher if somebody wants it. They can get the voucher, but to get it to the housing provider. there's a number of steps that the housing provider has to go through, including inspections, corrections, and the fact that the federal government can cancel the contract at any time, although the lease cannot be canceled. So I would really suggest you take a good look at that, and instead of mandating it, try to put in incentives to use it. Because like I said earlier with this, I think the unintended consequences are going to be less units available. And that's not what we need, and that's not what we want. So I do hope you listen to the testifiers that we heard earlier today with their concerns and work with them to make a bill that we can actually vote for. But at this time, I suggest a no vote on this bill. And with that, I would request a roll call.
Roll call is requested on the bill. We'll go to Vice Chair Agbaje in a second. I just wanted to offer a few comments. First, I wanted to thank members of our committee that have contributed to this bill and this work. Representative Kozlowski, Representative Perez-Vega, Representative Herr, who isn't on our committee but has several bills. And I specifically want to thank Representative Hassan, who's worked on several of these provisions every single year she's been at the legislature. And I especially want to thank Vice Chair Agbaje for her leadership to keep the vision forward about our intent of this bill while working with every stakeholder to move this work forward. And I really feel we have a strong bill before us, even knowing that it's not probably the finished product, that we still have more work to do. Members, everyone deserves a safe and stable, affordable home. But we've heard from Minnesotans that have testified in front of this committee and have been at the legislature for years that is not the reality for everyone. And our housing crisis is deepening, especially for our renters, especially for those that have our lowest incomes. And it was raised the notion of balance. And that's interesting to me in that, I think we have an extreme power imbalance between our landlords and our renters. There's a natural power imbalance there. But the fact is we haven't looked or made significant changes to our landlord-tenant laws in decades or generations. And I think it is appropriate for us to listen to Minnesotans, listen to renters, and to maybe rebalance that a little bit. And I see that that's what this bill will do by, I think, codifying what are some best practices and making sure that Minnesota renters have a greater chance at housing stability. And so with that, again, I want to thank every member of the committee who's heard these bills, who's offered comments that have ultimately contributed to where the language is at and where it will go. And with that, I'll go to Vice Chair Agbaje for final comments.
Thank you, Chair Howard, and thank you, members of the committee. I'll just start by saying I am a renter, and I got into this work primarily because I saw that so many laws related to landlords and renters were overwhelmingly in favor of landlords. And if you are a renter who's not particularly savvy, doesn't come from a legal background like I do, you may not know what to do when you get into a situation when you have a landlord who's unresponsive, who may not want to hold up their end of the bargain, and may not necessarily really know how to do the job of being a housing provider. And so what this bill does is it really puts together kind of those best practices, as we heard from one of the letters. And I think for the landlords who are already doing this, maybe even going above and beyond this, it's not really going to affect you. But we want to make sure that we are protecting our renters, protecting the most vulnerable in our communities who are unfortunately left to fend for themselves in some of the worst type of housing that we have in the state of Minnesota. And so this bill is meant to begin to address some of those issues. We heard a lot today from people saying that, source of income discrimination is really just forcing them into a contract. Well, if you're a landlord and you're a business, you are doing business in the public space. So it means regardless of who you're renting to, you've had to register, you've had to get a license, you've had to buy insurance, you've had to do inspections, a number of things in order just to be able to rent whatever unit you have. And those are the same types of things you would have to do because you're public facing to be able to comply with anti-discrimination laws that we have for all protected classes. And in Minnesota, having public assistance, status with regards to public assistance is already a protected class. And so I would just say to those who are worried about that is that if you want to be a landlord and want to do business, this is something you are going to have to consider. I think on some of the other issues we've heard, on the right to attorney for public housing, we've heard when this bill was heard that public housing cases are actually really small in number. But I do hear that concern of like, how are we going to pay for it? And I think that's something we can continue to discuss. On the heating issue, again, cities are already doing this. All state law would do is just make a uniform standard, and cities could do more than that. And then finally on expungements. This is really the piece that struck me when I came back to Minnesota after doing some work in Massachusetts, where expungements there are basically automatic once the case is dismissed or found in favor of the tenant or there's a settlement agreement. But in Minnesota, they make you carry that one situation or one mistake or one time you may have been in the hospital with you for years. And so I think we finally have an opportunity to give people that clean slate. I do not know how much more information people really need to know about a previous eviction, considering that there are so many other factors and indicators that can tell you if a person has the ability to pay. We heard an example about if you were renting a car, people might want to know how you did with previous car rentals. Last time I rented a car, they didn't do a background check on me, so I don't think they would know. But when it comes to housing, what we've done with the way that our expungement law is written is we've basically told people, once you've made a mistake, you basically aren't really allowed in dignified housing for years. And so I want to end to say that housing is a human right, and this bill starts to get us towards that by keeping people housed, by ensuring that landlords and tenants can focus on building that relationship that many of them do have, and that by allowing people to move on from a bad situation. And someone else said that we have to make sure that we are wary of unintended consequences of what we write. But I think we've seen the unintended consequences of the current laws that we have, and this is our opportunity to ensure that we're doing them better. So thank you for the committee's time. I thank all the legislators who helped put this bill together, and I look forward to support as this continues to move along. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Agbaje. And one housekeeping to make sure that we have the motion correctly. I want to move that we amend the DE as amendment to the bill first before we take the vote. So I will move that the DE 3 as amended be adopted onto House File 917. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The motion carries. All right. And now we'll take the roll call vote on House File 917 as amended.
Chair Howard.
Chair votes aye.
Chair Howard, aye. Vice Chair Agbaje.
Yes.
Vice Chair Agbaje, aye. Representative Johnson.
No.
Representative Johnson, nay. Representative Chaw.
Yes.
Representative Chaw, aye. Representative Dotseth.
No.
Representative Dotseth, nay. Representative Hassan.
Hassan votes aye.
Representative Hassan, aye. Representative Hussein.
Aye.
Representative Hussein, aye. Representative Kozlowski.
Aye.
Representative Kozlowski, aye. Representative Myers.
Nay.
Representative Myers, nay. Representative Nash is excused. Representative Norris.
Aye.
Representative Norris, aye. Representative Perez Vega.
Aye.
Representative Perez Vega, aye. Representative Petersburg.
No.
Representative Petersburg, nay. Chair, that concludes roll call with 8 aye, 4 nay, and 1 excused.
With that, the bill passes as amended and is re-referred to the House Judiciary and Civil Law, Finance, and Policy Committee. Members, that concludes our business today. We'll be back tomorrow with 6 bills. With that, we are adjourned.